Welcome to a special Coffee with Samso, where we are doing an exploration discovery series. We'll be talking to people in the industry who have worked or are very intimate with projects that are significant in sort of the exploration world. Today we're testing out the West Musgrave Ni-Cu-PGE discovery by Western Mining. I've got Jon Hronsky here, who was right in the middle of things, and Jon, thank you for giving time.
Pleasure. No, pleasure.
Look, Jon, it's as we've been talking prior to recording, it's a fantastic sort of moment in mineral exploration life, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
Maybe just give us a quick intro and we'll just sort of stumble our way through the story.
Well, thanks, Noel. Look, I think any major new discovery in a brand new greenfields province is always significant, and that's what the Musgrave is. And since our initial discoveries, BHP's found a number of additional deposits, and Cassini also made another discovery. But I think maybe the significance of this discovery beyond the discovery itself relates to the thought processes that went into the original targeting, which in some ways were quite different to the way that a lot of regional exploration targeting happened until then, but now are in a way a really good example of processes and concepts that are now being widely used in the industry. So in that sense, you know, I would probably venture to say it was a bit of a pioneer case for exploration targeting based on using really large-scale concepts around lithospheric architecture, geodynamics, and the big picture signals of these mineral systems.
Well, take a step back. I guess the West Musgrave is approximately where the point of the three states meet.
Pretty close. WA, South Australia, Northern Territory.
Yeah, so they're about sort of geographically...
About 100 kilometres or so west of that point, yeah.
Yeah. So I stumbled on this story through an ex-colleague, ex-uni friend of mine, Charles McHugh, who sent that to me. And look, it's a really good story. I want you to sort of drive it from the start, so to give everyone context and where things were at that time, because at that time nickel exploration was really commoditized, and we. But I'll let you go.
So this is a story that, if I'm going to explain it fully, I do have to go into a historical context, right? So Western Australia, of course, is known for its nickel, following the discovery of Kambalda in 1966, and then the big nickel boom. But then things sort of died away. But in the late 80s, there was a bit of a revival of nickel again. You had Outokumpu developing Forrestania, ACM starting to develop Mount Keith, and ultimately Western Mining bought them. And Western Mining redeveloped Agnew. But up until, say, that period of time, the idea in the West, and certainly in Australia, was nickel exploration was all about commoditite nickel, the Kambalda style, the Mount Keith style. But about that time, what was happening globally was a pretty significant thing, and that was the end of the Cold War. We had the Berlin Wall come down in '89, we had the Soviet Union end in '91. And up to then, in a way that I think a lot of your listeners, probably living in a globalised world for the last 3 decades, probably don't really understand. We had two separate economic systems. So, Australia operated in the Western world system, and there was a completely different system. Comecon was probably the technical term for it, but centred on the Soviet Union, that we didn't really interact with. But it became clear around about 1990, as all this was changing, that there was this magnificent deposit in Russia called Norilsk. Much higher grade, much better than anything we had in the nickel world. So Western Mining, as one of the world's 2 or 3 top Western world nickel producers, said, well, that's interesting, we're good at exploration, let's see whether we can find a deposit like Norilsk, which was a completely different style. It was associated with mafic intrusive rocks rather than ultramafic commoditite rocks. So an effort started in Western Mining to look at Norilsk, and a guy called John Simmons, who today works as a technical specialist for Chalice, was involved with that process and taking that forward. So we were looking for Norilsk, but we also had this concept that we needed to be very careful that we found the next big deposit in Western Mining rather than someone else, because the feeling was the nickel market was if anyone found a big nickel deposit, they would sort of dominate the market. Probably wasn't actually true. But the next thing that happened was in 1994, Diamond Fields found the Voisey Bay deposit in Canada, which wasn't like a komatiite and it wasn't like Norilsk. It was something completely different. Now, that was kind of a bit of a watershed moment in how we thought about nickel exploration. But before, so this is 94, 95, we became aware of Voisey's Bay, right? So, but just let me take you back from that and some of the things that had happened. In 93, I started working as a nickel specialist in Western mining. I'd been in gold and up until then, but they said, go and work in nickel. So I had to learn it from scratch. Initially, I started working on the komatiite deposits, and I started looking at them a bit differently to how they'd been looked at before, and I saw that you could actually, in a regional scale, start to predict where the deposits were. If you interpreted the big faults, you interpreted where the hottest komatiites were coming out. So it was a question of, very simple concept really, it's the cracks where the hot stuff comes out the most, that's where the ore bodies are. There's a whole lot of stuff that's written, but fundamentally that's what it boils down to. And I started thinking about, could we apply this concept more widely? I was lucky enough to have a trip to Norilsk in 94, got to see it, and the ideas were starting to evolve. So when Voisey's Bay was announced, and Western Mining and Voisey's Bay was hosted by a rock type called troctolite, which had never been known to host nickel before. It's just a type of mafic intrusion. And there was this, we better go and look for troctolite nickel now. We were looking for Norilsk nickel. Norilsk nickel was characterised as being associated with flood basalts. So instead of running around looking for flood basalts around the world, let's look for troctolites. And I guess I put up the argument, and supported by John Simmons, that no, actually, what we need to look for is the generic category of mafic intrusion hosted nickel related to the fundamental controls. And we were starting to see these fundamental controls. We were starting to see that these deposits were forming in consistent locations around the margin of these blocks of old, strong lithosphere, often called cratons, and we could see that they were associated with the areas where regionally you could see that there had been a really strong focus of magmatism. So we came up with the idea of the holistic nickel sulfide model, or the unified nickel sulfide model. In that presentation you're looking at, I'd sort of listed some of those early documents, 95, 96, where we put that out. So we kind of won that argument. We managed to persuade the management that this is what we should do.
Was it difficult to do that at that time?
Yeah, it always is, I mean, when you're relatively junior in an organisation. But what I will say is, while it was difficult in Western mining, it probably would have been impossible in many other organisations. So I'll make that comment, because Western mining was an organisation that had a significant openness under Roy Woodall, and the culture that even persisted after Roy Woodall, because he of course finished as exploration director in 95, and it was a culture that was a lot more sympathetic to that than other organisations. And many people still had, the way I saw it was the Norilsk model, the troctolite model, where you look narrowly at a particular deposit type and its analogue characteristics and look for that. That was an example of 20th century geology that we needed to move on from, and we needed to start thinking in terms of mineral systems and the big picture. And I think this was probably one of the earliest actual practical applications of mineral system concept, right? Where what I then did was look at, in that stage my brief was Western Australia, that was responsibility. So I thought, well, what are the key elements? Lithospheric architecture, distribution of mafic, ultramafic masses. So what we did was, what I did was make a map of WA where I looked at that. I interpreted the architecture, I interpreted that, I looked at where everything was converging, the idea that the biggest fluxes, the biggest concentrations are going to be where the faults all intersect. And the Musgrave came out. So we said, let's...
This is a big structure you're talking about.
Yeah, really big, fundamental structures, hundreds of kilometres long. The things like the margin of the Yilgarn Craton, the margin of the Pilbara Craton, the Mundrabilla Fault. So all these things were converging there. And we saw in the gravity as well. So we looked at the mapping of mafics and ultramafics, but we saw the gravity and a big gravity anomaly is telling you you've got a dense mass at the bottom of the crust, and that dense mass is sort of mafic intrusion. So there's the mafic rocks that come to the surface as basalts and near surface intrusions, but most of it gets left behind at the base of the crust, and that's what gravity helps us see. So we put all those things together and came up with, in some ways, like a fairly obvious target, but no one had really explored it for nickel sulfides. The BMR, which is or AGSO as it was then, the precursor to Geoscience Australia, they'd been out there. Someone had written a report saying it didn't have mineral potential based on a few samples and left it as at that. So anyway, that was how we targeted it. But Noel, if I can make a diversion, there's another thing that happened that was really important in allowing us to do that. But I should probably stop and let you ask some questions.
I think the story needs to be told and historical, right? And you were there. I think that's very important. Yeah, carry on.
Well, the other perspective on this, and another part of the reason why the Musgrave was still there, is that, you know, Central Australia was basically Aboriginal freehold land, and in the 1980s, if you worked in a major mining company, well, any mining company really, you just didn't go on freehold land, because that would mean you'd have to negotiate with the Aboriginal peoples, right? And the culture was, well, you didn't do that. You would just operate. It was almost like it was a foreign country. But what was interesting was, you know, we had the Mabo decision in 92, and then we had WIC in 93. And the net result of those two decisions was that it kind of inverted the priorities, because what it meant was now you had to negotiate with Aboriginal groups to get land access, and in the area outside the freehold land, at least initially, before things got organised, no one knew who to negotiate with. Whereas in the freehold land, you actually had a clear pathway. You had a clear structure. So in that sense, it was actually it became more favourable. So all of a sudden, like, if in 1990 I'd said to my management at Western Mining, I want to apply for this ground out in the Musgrave, they would have said, you're kidding, no way. In 1995, when I wanted to apply for that ground, I actually could do it because of what happened in between. So that's why, you know, in the presentation you reference, I say there were three historical things that happened which set up the context for the Musgrave. The end of the Cold War, for the reasons I've just explained, the discovery of Voisey Bay in Labrador in Canada, and the Mabo and the WIC decisions, which all were part of that story. But, you know, I do have to tell you this story as well in the context of the traditional owners of the Musgrave, because it really sticks in my mind. So at this stage, you know, we applied for that ground out in the Musgrave, and Western Mining's base was the McDonald Street office in Kalgoorlie. It's now part of the Curtin University complex and whatever. Historical old building that was built actually by Herbert Hoover as part of Buick Mooring at the turn of the last century. But so I'm sitting in this office one day, and the receptionist knocks on the door, my office door, and says, I've got these people who've come to see you, to talk to you about the West Musgrave project. I said, oh, okay. So this couple came in, a lady and a man. They're clearly Aboriginal elders, and the man didn't do any of the talking, the lady did all the talking. But she said to me, we've seen that you've applied for ground over our project area, and you know, over our lands, right? So so she said, you know, we've seen you've applied for this ground, right? And we have driven all the way here to tell you that we would really like to get a mine on this ground, because that'll be great for our community, and we'll do whatever we can to help you to do that. And that was 1995. So, and I'm kind of hoping that Oz Minerals will announce their final investment decision. The project's looking very good, I'm told. Will announce their final investment decision for this project either later this year or early next year. So we finally got there, a lot longer than I would have liked, but hope, and you know, I don't know whether these elders are still alive or not, and they probably aren't after that period of time, but you know, it's a great thing that we're finally getting there. So yeah.
I mean, when you talk of this story, and you and I sort of brought this topic up prior to us doing the recording, is that it's such a shift in thinking, right?
Yes, it was. It was a big shift in
Yeah,
thinking.
and was it a nickel moment or was it an exploration moment, in your opinion?
I do think it was a, without wanting to sound immodest or anything, I do think it was a pretty seminal moment in the exploration industry because it changed the paradigm, the lens through which we looked at things. Now, it was in nickel, right? So, but I think nickel was just where it was easiest to do, right? So I think it was a paradigm shift from thinking about ore deposits as the ore deposit itself and how you describe the ore deposit to starting to think about the big system that made the ore deposit and what were the signals of that, what was the signature of that, and how could you actually see that, and how could you be predictive, right? Because all the stuff about the ore deposit, you're not going to see it until you're on top of it. So if you're looking at a map of WA, you're not going to see those things. But what are the things that you could see on a map of WA, right? Particularly given the really good pre-competitive data we get from our government geoscience agencies, which are totally critical to this story.
I mean, the things that you mentioned, the lithospheric architecture, the deep-seated structures, the big structures, not the little ones that you
That's right.
hard to find, right? And then the magma, it's going to come from that depth.
From the mantle, yes.
Mantle. This kind of stuff is now, today, you go, oh yeah, obviously.
Yeah, no, I think so. Yeah, I think most people in nickel would go, yeah, no.
Yeah, and when you spoke about how the structures where you get the crossing structures, that's the path of least resistance.
Yes.
People think, oh, obviously, but it must have been something not thought of at that point in time.
People didn't look at it that way. They kind of saw that as arm waving, and I guess, to be honest, it was something. While there were some earlier applications of this, it played a role in the discovery of Olympic Dam, for example, the lineaments, but it was only really put on a really robust basis when we started to get regional image processed geoscientific data sets. So there's another thing that a lot of people may not realise was it was only in the late 1980s, so maybe a few years earlier than this phase that we're talking about, that we first got the ability to look at a magnetic map of WA or a gravity map of WA where it was presented as an image that kind of looked like geology. Before then, all we ever got was contour maps, which, I'm old enough as a student to have done a magnetometer survey, collected the data in a notebook and then had to hand contour it up, right? Nowadays, we assume that the image comes as some sort of grayscale gridded image. That technology arrived at the end of the 1980s, and all of a sudden it gave us a new view of the world, right? So one of the things about geology as a science, and the exploration part of geology is no different, is the science moves forward when we get a new data set, a new perspective. Many of your viewers may know that the theory of plate tectonics was developed after the Second World War in the 60s, but what was the key new data set? It was a map of the seafloor, right? We didn't have a map of the seafloor before World War II. We got one after World War II because kind of you needed it for submarines, right? So it was, that was but then we had it, and we started to see things that we hadn't seen before, like the mid-Atlantic ridges and things, subduction zones and things like that. And I think it was no different. So once we started to get these data sets in the late 80s, where we would get geophysical data that looked like geology, but over really wide areas, we started to see these patterns, or at least some people did, right? And they were different to maybe what people had thought about before. So it allowed, that was one of the other things that allowed for this new perspective.
So you've pinpointed West Musgrave. You talk about in that.
When we say pinpointed, we say this is a broad area.
This is a broad, yeah.
We've still got to then go and find the deposit.
Correct.
And a lot of good work has to go on to do that. Yeah.
So my question was, you've isolated. You talk about how you picked 3 regions. One was the East Kimberley. One was the West Musgrave. One was what now we know as Tropicana.
It was.
Right?
It was. So that was a bit frustrating, I guess. But we targeted because it looked like this really interesting anomalous area along the Craton margin. We went out there. We did a first pass of regional geochem sampling. Didn't pick up any nickel. Picked up some strong gold. And then, but our management were like, oh well, you're just trying to keep your jobs. You said it was a nickel project, now you're saying it's a gold project. What is it going to be, a copper project next week? So anyway, we did have to drop that ground, unfortunately, and history was written, but that's fine. There's many different pathways to discovery, and it turned out there was an interesting and very complex piece of geology there. And you know what? There is even a little bit of nickel there, because people over the years have found a bit of nickel.
Yeah, I mean, that's
well.
Kind of opening regions and districts is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So what happened, that next step? You go to West Musgrave, then what happened?
Well, of course you have to negotiate with the traditional owners. So, and this is a new process then, right? Now I think, there was so much, I don't know, fear, anxiety in the industry in the 90s about Marbo and all it's going to be the end of the world, right?
Yeah.
It hasn't been, right? We have an industry that I think works well with traditional owners in terms of land access, and there's obviously always areas where things can be streamlined, but it's not something that prevents us from doing exploration. We were pioneering that process. We had to work it through, both from the point of view, I suppose, of the traditional owners and the various stakeholders in the company. So it took us a little while to get that access. And then we went out there and the first thing we did was just a regional lag sampling program. And we probably were lucky in that it was a 2-point anomaly on a kilometre by 500 metre spaced grid, but they were quite strong samples. They were quite unequivocally related to mineralisation. So we followed that up, and the project geo was a guy called Rob Waugh, who now runs a very successful mining company, Musgrave Minerals.
Yep.
In fact, the name does in fact go back to the Musgraves, even though now they're mainly in the area around Kew. But Rob was a very excellent field geologist, and he discovered this subcrop, in the area where we had these broad-spaced geochem samples, and Noel, it was not much bigger than this room that we're in, and it was this subcrop. It was a gossan. It was a subcrop of mineralisation. We realise now it was the Babel gossan, and because it's mostly sand dune country out there. So what became apparent was there was this one little bit of the ore body, really little bit, that stuck out of the ground, and it was sort of gossanous fragments. And what happened is the wind had blown it down, generated a plume, right? So it had blown small bits of this, downwind, and we'd picked up 2 samples in the downwind plume. But when you saw that, you knew that looked pretty encouraging. And then when we did an EM survey and we got a couple of big EM anomalies, we thought, look, this probably is mineralisation. So when we actually drilled the hole, we weren't that surprised to hit mineralisation, but it was good to get that first, that first good hit. But the point I want to make in terms of context and opening up new provinces, right? When we look at the Musgrave, we made those discoveries. Western Mining did work on it. BHP did some more work on it. They made a number of significant additional discoveries. Probably the most significant is the Sukhoth deposit, which is a copper palladium system more than anything. It doesn't have that much nickel in it. And, there's a Cassini, we put a resource of 150 million tonnes of ore, about 0.6 copper on it. I think Oz are doing a lot of work now. That'll grow. I tell you that will grow. That will become a lot bigger. The Yapsu deposit, a sort of Nebo lookalike, slightly higher in PGEs, but a bit deeper. That's something you're going to hear more of in the future. One Tree Hill, that was a BHP geophysical anomaly that in Cassini we followed up, and we made that's another one of those copper-rich systems. Turned out the Musgrave had nickel-copper systems like Nebo, Babel and Yapsu, and then copper-dominant systems like Sukhoth and One Tree Hill. So One Tree Hill, I think, the last phase of drilling there, we got 40 metres at 1.2%, 20 metres at 1.8, not followed up, right? But that's because it's part of that bigger project. So there's now mineralisation that stretches over a belt that's 40 kilometres long. Now, interestingly enough, the only spot that ever had any surface geochem, that one little bit of subcrop that Rob Waugh found in 1999, right? So, in other words, you can have a really big province with only a very subtle surface expression. So I think that's pretty important.
I mean, that kind of story, reminds me straight away, goes to like Challenger, right? How they found that. And a lot of things like bronze rings were found, a little anomalous gold at the bottom of a rab hole, which is, you know,
a small little bit of clue,
that little bits and pieces, and that's exploration, right? And I think, you know, the reason why I enjoyed reading through this presentation is that it's a district, or it's a discovery of a district, and there was a shift in paradigm, as he said, the way you think, and there are lots of districts that are found just by thinking outside the box, you know, and following what could be. You know, the question is, you know, anything can be here as long as you got the right cooking equipment, the structure and potential source, then the rest is...
Sure. And that's why I'm so passionate about greenfields exploration, because I think that's the sort of work that produces the results that are really material for the world, for the nation. You know, the world needs nickel, the world needs copper. The Musgrave, I think, will be a 40, 50 year district that will probably supply that metal, but it's also nation building, because what it will be is the first world-class mine in Central Australia, right?
Yeah.
So the implications for opening up Central Australia, providing stable economic base for the traditional owners, the traditional communities out there, will be significant as well.
I mean, this kind of thinking, is Julimar due to that kind of thinking?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, Kevin Frost at Chalice used these same sort of concepts. Geoscience Australia had done some good work. Basically, you know, this is 20 years later, so using these concepts now, applying them, making maps, mineral system maps where they use these basic architectural concepts and mass flow, magma flux concepts to make a map of Australia. It highlighted that area around Julimar. You know, Kevin Frost for Chalice identified that area. They saw there was a really interesting belt of magnetic rocks which had never been looked at before, and targeted it, and then did the basic exploration. So, you know, the basic exploration doesn't change that much. It's surface sampling, it's EM, but it's getting you into those areas that I think you know, that's what you've got to pay attention to. So that was, you know, very much a following along the pathway of these sort of concepts.
And there are a lot of sort of lookalike structures now that people have identified and seen the proof of the pudding in Julimar, that they're all popping up.
Yeah, I mean, I think these ideas, you know, you probably want to talk to the serious guys, but from what I've been told, these ideas, being on a Craton margin, etc., were also incorporated into their targeting as well.
Yeah. And
for Nova, yeah.
In your opinion, I guess, you know, thinking big picture, everything, you know, where could be the next frontier, in your opinion, in Australia? That
look, I think there's a few, right? I think, you know, we're really just scratching the surface, but I will mention some. So, and declare an interest. I mean, I'm a director of Encounter Resources, and we're been very aggressive in the last 18 months or so in acquiring ground in the greater McArthur Basin of the Northern Territory on the basis of some really good work that Geoscience Australia have been doing. They spent $100 million of public money, a very good investment in my opinion, in something called Exploring for the Future initiative. So they've collected a whole lot of good geoscience data. They've drilled some very, very interesting deep holes, and with Encounter, we've recognised the potential for a major new copper province, right? So, you know, you look at Australia for copper, we don't have as much. We punch above our weight in most other metals, but not so much in copper. The world needs copper, right? What we're looking for is the Pilbara of copper, right? And you look at the greater McArthur Basin and you see there's one giant copper deposit, that's Mount Isa, but it kind of sits alone. Is that likely that we've got a mineral system that's generated one giant deposit? Because we know these things are big systems. You know, you just look at the African copper belt. I don't think so. But where are the others? Well, we have been systematically trying to applying these architectural concepts. You know, without going into details, a slightly different variant because we're looking for sedimentary hosted deposits rather than nickel sulfide hosted deposits. But the underlying concepts of the big structures, the permeability architecture are the same. So we've applied those ideas. We've now acquired a very significant land position. We've attracted BHP, the world's biggest mining company, into a copper-focused joint venture at Elliott. So that's something that really will be revving up from now on. We've kind of signed off on all that. Number of other really interesting projects you'll hear a lot more about. So that's one example.
I mean, when you talk about all these things, applying architecture and all that to different types, it reminds me of people building sort of mega structures, and you're going, how the hell did they build that thing? And it's just simple engineering, right?
Yeah.
And then changing a few things, and like building the Golden Gate Bridge and things like that. That's just engineering, right? Full stop.
That's right, Noel. So I think often the actual key, so my view of targeting is the actual key fundamental concepts are usually relatively simple, and there's only 2 or 3 of them. The challenge is seeing their manifestation in the data sets you have available to you. And frankly, if you don't have any data, you can't do it. So if you're in a country, like there's many countries in the world where the data is really poor, well then you can't really apply these ideas. But if we're in a country like Australia, where we've been really lucky, or I think it's strategic, where the government has gone and collected a whole lot of these detailed data sets, so gravity, magnetics, increasingly passive seismic, these data sets that really help you map this architecture, you can then start to see these things. You can start to be predictive. It's a big competitive advantage for Australia, right? And my vision is, okay, now we've got good high resolution gravity over a lot of Australia. I think the next stage is good detailed passive seismic, because that looks deeper, it gives us a new data set, and that's going to see all these big structures. I think that's the pathway we're on.
I mean, I personally think of I sort of ventured into South Australia because I was involved in a company. We had a project then, and I started looking around and I started realizing that, the Gwalar is as rich as most of the cratons that we know. However, it's sort of been neglected because it's too hard, too expensive, etc., etc. But when you look at what we've discovered around that area, is Olympic Dam and Prominent Hill. They're big, mega deposits, right?
Well, it is interesting because Olympic Dam was found in 75, and for a long time there were no other big significant discoveries. But then we've had Prominent Hill, we've had Carrapateena, we've had Oak Dam West, all in this century.
And they're all sort of in that zone,
in that Olympic belt, which, by the way, is pretty much paralleling a craton margin or one of these fundamental lithospheric boundaries.
And that sort of swims around to the other side where you get the Tropicanas and etc. And then right in the middle there, you've got Challenger, who was again a lone sailor. You could speak, right? He's basically the only one guy. 200 kilometers. You got Tankili and all that, but you couldn't see that in the gold fields, right? There's no way in the world you have 3 sort of majorish deposits and nothing in between.
Yep. No, there's still lots and lots of potential all through Australia. I like the kind of what we call sometimes the Rhodinian margin or the Precambrian margin of Australia for orogenic gold. Coming up from the Delamerian in South Australia all the way through Victoria, New South Wales, possibly even into Queensland or the Northern Territory. So, there's a lot of people out there doing good work, and unfortunately that early stage stuff often is below the radar. It's not the sort of stuff that brokers will necessarily promote to clients and so on. But it's really important that work does get funded in our industry, because that's where the really big new things come from.
I mean, I like your talk about the encounter stuff, because you got a zone that historically has produced a lot of minerals, metals, and there must be more than one. So the system is already is big.
Absolutely. So what Mount Isa does is provide a validation of the sediment-hosted copper system for the greater McArthur Basin, and we know from other systems that you always get multiple deposits. So that's what we're looking for. But what the new data sets from the government have done has helped us decide what are the spots that look favourable. Otherwise it's just a concept, right? It's like, we think there's more, but where? Well, Northern Territory is a big place, right? But you start to get these data sets and you can start to refine things quite a lot.
And you get the same around, the East Coast there, the New England and everything else. And they're all mineralised, and no one's really found anything more. Look, John, fantastic. I really, this is a bit of a sort of a discovery kind of series, and it's good to have this conversation, because exploration is one of those things that people just think it's, 2 meters at 5 grams and, 5,000 meter drilling program is exploration, right? But it's this big stuff that it's very involving. It takes decades to get there. Right?
It does have a long gestation, doesn't it? I mean, I sometimes wish it was quicker. I mean, it'll be roughly 25, 26 years, from the initial concept of targeting in the Musgrave to what I hope is a development decision, and then probably a few more years to production. But it was a relatively remote area. It would have been quicker if it was found, near Kambalda. But I guess that's going to be the consequence of exploring remotely. But I think in Australia, those are the opportunities that we need to focus on. There'll be the next generation of discoveries. I mean, Australia's had a great run in resources over the last 3 or 4 decades. Most of that on the basis of discoveries that were made in the 60s and 70s, right? And then we've reaped the benefit of it. And what I think we're seeing, and I've been calling for this in a number of forums for more than a decade, a renaissance in greenfields exploration in this country. And I actually think we're seeing it. I think if you look at the discoveries coming through, the Julimars, the Hemis, the Havirons, the Stavely, Cayley Lode at Stavely, Boda in New South Wales, we really are starting to. Did I mention Haviron? I hope so.
Yeah,
Winu, I hadn't mentioned. But sorry, but don't want to leave anyone out. But I just want to say, look, we've had a bunch of exciting new greenfields discoveries. So we haven't had this sort of focus for this clustering of new discoveries for a long time. I reckon we're going to hear a lot more. And one of the reasons is, success breeds success. One of the reasons we haven't had enough greenfield discovery over the last few decades is not enough people have been doing it, right? Not enough money's been spent. You have a bit of success, all of a sudden people can see the value created by a discovery like Hemi or a discovery like Julimar, and then the money goes into it. Now, not all that money is well spent, but a lot of it will be. Yeah. So I reckon we'll get more discoveries by going out into these frontiers.
Oh, look, I agree. I think we're entering a phase, or we are in a phase where discoveries are almost believed.
Yeah.
Whereas before it was
that's right.
Long shot, mate.
That's right. Yeah. So I think it's a significant shift. So.
All right. Thank you for your time, and it's fantastic. And you mentioned Havrion, and I'm hoping to get that a conversation with Callum Baxter there. But anyway, thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Noel. Appreciate it.